Thank you,
or
Madam
5
Chair.
minutes.
And before I focus on my questions, I would simply note I've just come from a Science Committee meeting, and I would suggest to my colleagues, both in Congress and around the country, one of the keys to addressing the future of this great planet and the issues that we address here from a business perspective is changing how we create our energy sources. Urging the bipartisan leadership, the bicameral leadership, the appropriations process to fully fund fusion research so that we can go to the next generation of energy production for this planet and the off-world. We've got to focus on that. But if we won't spend time and resources on the next source, well, that's our fate. Let me pull back closer to home. November of 2021, the SEC issued revised guidance aimed at broadening the scope and increasing the volume of shareholder proposals to be considered by public companies. Instead of focusing on how a social policy matter might impact the actual business, these proposals can now take aim at the wider aspects to society, unrelated to specific business issues. Mr. Natram, from your understanding, how does the SEC staff determine an issue has a broad social impact? Who gets to play God on that one?
That is an excellent question. It raises a number of questions, the guidance. What is the society that we're looking at? Is it the locality in which a company operates? Is it the entire United States? Is it the entire world? What is an impact? What is a measurable impact? Who is being impacted? And has Congress actually empowered the SEC to make those decisions?
Mr. Berry, could you also discuss this?
Certainly, there is a tremendous amount of viewpoint bias that the SEC staff exercises here. And they'll call one thing significant and another insignificant on pretty nakedly political grounds.
So in your observations, does there need to be any relationship to the operations of the company to get one of these classifications, these whatever you want to call it?
So really the upshot of what the SEC said in 14L is that there doesn't need to be any tie whatsoever.
Oh my goodness. Mr. Berry, in your written testimony, you provide historic context to how the SEC requires public companies to interact with shareholders. Could you expand on this historic perspective, specifically how the SEC arrived at the current treatment of shareholder proposals and how this position has changed over the past decades?
So the SEC originally focused its rulemaking on the core mandate of disclosure, what Congress directly authorized. But over the decades, the SEC has gotten more into the substance of corporate governance, something that the courts have disfavored, and yet we're still here. In the last few decades, the SEC has essentially opened the gates to all manner of shareholder proposals in the E&ES space.
Kind of following up on that, Mr. Doyle, also looking at the historic perspective, can you discuss how the proxy process has evolved from the, say, mid-1900s to where we are today?
The process itself?
Please.
Yes, I certainly can. As I think has been mentioned by a couple of the witnesses already, it is developed, I'm trying to come up with the right term here. It has developed, as was mentioned, it was first not talked about through the Security and Exchange Commission. And then, as mentioned, they started to provide rules for their involvement. And I will mention that the issue, that the more recent issue with proxy advisors is their inherent bias on both the recommendations that they make for clients that they have, as well as for those that they make have consulting services for. And I don't know if that answers a particular question.
Fair point. The SEC's aggressive rulemaking agenda is set to intimidate investors, inundate, I should say, investors with a flood of non-material information that public companies are required to disclose. Mr. Natram, could you speak to the challenges and compliance costs that public companies face and how they are preparing themselves for this? This is not free, right?
It's absolutely not free. That there is a dollar cost associated with responding to these proposals, but really for the larger cost and the bigger impact to the investors that companies are supposedly serving is the distraction from actually focused on the underlying business. Manufacturers are facing an increased challenge. We have supply chain constraints, workforce constraints, competition from China, raw material constraints. Taking time and attention away from that to respond to shareholder, to activists is really
Gentleman's time
detrimental.
to expire.
Thank you, Madam Chair.